Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Back in February, I published this video about the Knickebein navigation system, which was used by the German Air Force in World War II. And I made this video in response to Taboo Conspiracy, who was claiming that the system wouldn't work on a globe, and so I was showing how it would. Well, recently GlobeBusters did a stream in response to this, attempting to double down on the claim that the system would not work on a globe, except they made a couple of major mistakes. So, in case anyone missed the original video, here's a brief recap. Whenever you transmit wave signals, such as radio, the beams will get larger the further away they get from the source, known as divergence. The lower the frequency, the greater the divergence, the higher the frequency, the less the divergence. Now, Knickebein was a radio navigation system which transmitted signals from two different locations, and these signals would cross over each other above a selected target. The Luftwaffe planes would fly along one of the beams, and when they intersected the second beam, they knew they were in the right place to release their bombs. This allowed them to get very accurate attacks at night and even in bad weather. Now, Taboo's argument came due to this clip from a documentary series called The Secret War.
Dr. Jones took the message to Professor Lindemann, his old tutor and now scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, and tried to persuade him of the serious threat posed by the Knickebein beams. But Lindemann was not convinced, pointing out that at the high frequencies necessary for an accurate beam, the curvature of the Earth would prevent its being directed against targets in Britain.
Now, the argument for this was that at distances of up to 450 miles that the antennas were from the target in Derby, the frequency needed for a radio beam to remain narrow enough to be accurate for bombing would have been too high to actually diffract around the curvature of Earth, so the signal would have wound up being about 100,000 feet above the bombers. Except, as I showed in my video, the Knickebein system worked quite differently. It was derived from the Lorentz beam, which transmitted two slightly different signals next to each other, which could then be angled to create a very narrow overlap, and the German pilots would aim to fly along this overlap. This method allowed for much lower frequencies to be used, which would then allow for the signals to diffract more around the curvature of Earth and thus be able to reach pilots further around the globe. However, the GlobeBusters stream attempted to debunk this. Specifically, they had Alan on, who runs the channel Space Audits.
So what he's invoking here with his video, you can watch. I'm not going to play it because for copyrights or whatever, but it's pretty lengthy. But the argument he's making is just indiscriminate diffraction, right? It's just diffraction all over the place. The left of center beam and the right of center signal are all just diffracting, but it somehow produces a coherent beam that's used for navigation. Now this isn't possible because when we get into the specifics of the target range, we know that the length of the beam was 450 yards wide. So after this intersection point is 450 yards wide. So that's the exact amount of diffraction that came from this 10 millimeter wave to end up here, right? So it's not indiscriminate diffraction. This explanation isn't tenable. So this path here, right, at its maximum dimension of diffraction is 400 yards over target, coming from a distance of 451 miles. It's a 451 mile horizontal propagation, accurate to
they were doing this in the 40s?
Accurate up to 250 meters to drop bombs, dog.
Now, for some context, British intelligence suspected the Germans were using some sort of radio navigation.
Told him, convinced him on the theory, now with Eccles's paper, that the beams would bend round sufficiently, that it was in the blind landing receiver, therefore they must be on frequencies to which the blind landing receivers could be set, and therefore we could listen for them.
They'd already found evidence of transmission sites at Stolberg Hill and Cleve, and a downed German bomber that they'd captured had a Lorentz landing system that was far more sensitive than what was needed for picking up local signals as they were coming into land.
Now, some of these blind landing receivers from crashed German aircraft had been examined at Farnborough by a radio expert, Squadron Leader Cox Walker.
So I asked Cox Walker if there was anything odd about the blind landing receiver, and first he said no. And then he said, but wait a minute. Yes, you know, it's much more sensitive than they would need for blind landing. And of course, that was it. Effectively, the prisoner had thought we wouldn't spot it because it looked to be an ordinary blind landing receiver, but in fact it was a much better receiver than one needed. It would have the necessary sensitivity, we thought, and so here was the answer.
So they suspected, correctly, that they were using this sort of system in reverse to guide the bombers to their target, and they knew the system operated on frequencies between 30 to 33 megahertz. So, to check for this, they fitted an old Avro Anson aircraft with a radio that was capable of detecting those frequencies, and on June 21st they detected two signals which overlapped above the major engine factory in Derby. And sure enough, those signals were being transmitted from Cleve and Stolberg Hill. Now, Stolberg Hill is 450 miles from Derby, and it's said that the signal that they found was 500 yards wide.
So this path here, right, at its maximum dimension of diffraction is 400 yards over target, coming from a distance of 451 miles.
So Alan is claiming that a 500-yard wide beam 450 miles away is too narrow, and that to have a signal that narrow at that distance, it wouldn't have diffracted enough to get around the curvature of Earth. Alan also posted similar to this on his X account, as well as commenting about it on my video, claiming he'd completely refuted the notion of it working on a globe. Now, he's probably correct with his assessment that a 500-yard wide beam from 450 miles away from a 100-foot high antenna wouldn't be picked up by a plane 20,000 feet in the air above a globe. However, if we look at the details laid out about this flight in the Secret War documentary, we can see his figures are actually quite a way off.
The crew hadn't been told any of the details of the Knickebein story. They'd simply been ordered to search for radio transmissions with the Lorentz characteristics, series of dots and dashes. And if they found any, to try to locate the bearing of the equisignal in the centre of the beam. So, Flight Lieutenant Bufton climbed away from Witten on a northerly heading in the darkness and the heavy cloud. Then, when they were very close to Spalding, faintly at first, but steadily growing clearer through the noise, the unmistakable sound of a series of Morse dots. And as they listened, the dots, now very loud, became a constant note, the equisignal in the middle of the beam. And as they continued on their northerly heading, that equisignal became a series of dashes. They had, without doubt, found the secret beam. The equisignal was just 400 yards wide. The frequency was exactly 31.5 megacycles. And on the charts, that beam passed directly over the critical Rolls-Royce aero engine factory at Derby.
Firstly, with regards to the distance of 450 miles, I did reply to Alan for verification on his claims, and he stated 450 miles was the distance from Stolberg Hill, the site of a Knickebein antenna, and Derby, where the crew found that the crossover of the beams was located. And that much is true. However, that claim has two big assumptions. Firstly, that the signal that they were picking up was actually being transmitted from Stolberg Hill, and secondly, that the aircraft was 450 miles from the transmitter when they picked it up.
Flight Lieutenant Bufton climbed away from Witten on a northerly heading in the darkness and the heavy cloud.
So the plane took off from RAF Witten, and the crew detected the beam as they were approaching Spalding.
Then, when they were very close to Spalding, faintly at first, but steadily growing clearer through the noise, the unmistakable sound of a series of Morse dots.
So they were flying north, and they picked up the signal south of Spalding. That's because the plan to find the beam was to fly along the eastern side of the UK, knowing any beams coming from Germany would have to cross over that area. Importantly, though, they were flying near Spalding when they found the beam, not Derby. Spalding is 56 miles to the east and slightly south. And that's significant, because if we plot a path from Stolberg Hill to Derby, the signal from there is way off to the north of Spalding. Now, British intelligence knew beforehand where these sites were located, Stolberg Hill and Cleve, which is how they knew roughly where to look for the beams. And if we draw a line from Derby to Cleve, it passes just south of Spalding. So, the plane was detecting a signal from Cleve's antenna, not Stolberg Hill, as Alan claimed. Cleve is 329 miles from Derby, not 450, and the plane wasn't even near Derby, it was near Spalding. So they were only about 270 miles from the source of the signal when they detected the beam. Now, granted, even at 270 miles, a 500-yard wide beam is probably still a problem for the globe, so let's address that.
And as they listened, the dots, now very loud, became a constant note, the equisignal in the middle of the beam. And as they continued on their northerly heading, that equisignal became a series of dashes. They had, without doubt, found the secret beam. The equisignal was just 400 yards wide. The frequency was exactly 31.5 megacycles.
They state the equisignal was 400 yards wide. Now, to be clear, the equisignal is not the width of the entire beam. An equisignal is where two signals merge together. This was the basis of how Knickebein worked, transmitting two slightly different signals together. One dots, one dashes, and when in the overlap between them, the signals merged to create a solid beep. And British intelligence suspected that this was what they were looking for because they knew the Germans were using the Lorenz receivers. So they knew the Germans would be using the equisignal for their guidance. And again, the Secret War even mentions that the crew were instructed to try and find the equisignal.
The details of the Knickebein story, they'd simply been ordered to search for radio transmissions with the Lorentz characteristics, series of dots and dashes. And if they found any, to try to locate the bearing of the equisignal in the center of the beam.
So they didn't find a 500-yard wide complete beam, they found a 500-yard wide crossover between two signals. Add to that the fact that his distances for the antenna were off by almost double what they were in reality, and you end up with a pretty invalid rebuttal. In fact, since I recorded this video, there's actually been two developments. Firstly, Austin Whitsitt, who was hosting the GlobeBusters stream which Alan was presenting on, last night was hosting a separate stream in which he was having a conversation with Will Duffy about the whole going to Antarctica for the final experiment, and he actually brought up this whole Knickebein argument.
Long story short, they sent these beams out and they were able to successfully intersect them from that far away of a distance. And they blew up the place successfully, right? So basically, the globe got Britain blown up, like quite literally. And then, so what? Say Dave McKeegan made a video responding to this, and he said that it was diffraction. That is objectively not a viable answer. That wasn't never proposed by any of these military scientists or engineers when they were talking about whether or not they could do this, because they knew it wasn't an option. Because when something diffracts, what happens is it continues to increase its width. The beam gets wider and wider as it gets diffracted. As it's getting blocked, it keeps getting wider and wider and wider. The beams had to stay within 400 to 500 yards each, or at the distance of 450 miles. McKeegan will probably not do a follow-up rebuttal. Like, he won't stillman our refutation of diffraction. The globe side will have a monolithic absorption of diffraction, and they'll never change it. So you can see why, from our perspective, it's like, if I saw a 24-hour sun, that'd be really perplexing. But it wouldn't mean that these like really coherent beams that were shot in order to blow up an entire, manufacturing plant in the World War II, that doesn't just dissipate.
Now, it kind of did sound a little bit like Austin was just bringing this up, almost acting like a safety net, that if we go to Antarctica and we see a 24-hour sun, it wouldn't actually matter because he thinks this Knickebein system wouldn't work on a globe, so therefore a 24-hour sun wouldn't actually matter. But anyway, his main argument is what Alan was saying, that at 450 miles away, he was claiming the entire beam width was 500 yards, which isn't the case. It was only the overlap that was narrow, and it wasn't even that narrow at 450 miles. It was that narrow at 270 miles. And it could be made that narrow by the fact that the beams were angled in relation to each other. And this brings us on to another tweet that Alan has since put out over on X. And he said, quote, "I would not advise using McKeegan's argument of beam overlap. That's a gross misunderstanding of how that radar function works. Additionally, even if you extend the equisignal to 500 yards and make the rest of the beam 1,000 yards, you still wouldn't be able to overcome the curvature of Earth." Well, 2 points there. Radar literally stands for radio detection and ranging. It sends out a radio signal from a transmitter that reflects off an object, and then that reflection goes back to the transmitter so that the radar station can work out how far away the object is. That is not how Knickebein worked, because the signal was not being reflected off the plane back to the antenna. The antenna was merely sending a one-way signal, essentially, that the bomber could fly along. And if you Google Knickebein beam, every single diagram that comes up showing how Knickebein worked or how the Lorentz system that it's derived from works shows overlapping beams with an equisignal along the middle. And now Alan's revised his argument to say, even if the equisignal's 500 yards, the entire beam would be 1,000. Well, previously he'd said the entire beam was 500 yards, so the equisignal would be 250. It seems like he thinks that the equisignal would always be half the width of the full beam, which is not the case. It's not how Knickebein worked. If you were going to fire two signals side by side, where the crossover was getting gradually just as big as the main signals themselves, you'd have the transmitters on each side sitting parallel to each other. By angling the antennas, though, you send the signals more out away from each other. And this angling of the beam came from the angled antennas that gave Knickebein its name. Knickebein translates to the crooked leg. Now, they had two types of antennas. They had the large ones and the small ones. The small ones were built rigid, with the left and right sides being angled towards each other, and these were built along the coastline of France where they were closer to Britain. However, the larger Knickebein antennas were built further away in the likes of Stolberg Hill and Cleve. Now, these structures weren't angled in the same manner. The actual metal truss framework was actually straight. The wire sections inside it, however, were on outriggers, which allowed them to be pivoted towards or away from each other. This would change the angle with which the left and right sides were firing towards or away from each other. That would not be needed if the equisignal was always just going to be half of the width of the entire beam. So the left and right sides could be angled between something like 180 to 161 degrees. That would allow them to control how wide the equisignal was at a given distance away from the transmitter. Now, in Secret War, R.V. Jones talks about how he uses one of T.L. Eckersley's papers on radio waves to show how the Knickebein system could, in theory, reach as far as Britain.
Convinced him on the theory, now, with Eckersley's paper, that the beams would bend round sufficiently, that it was in the blind landing receiver. Therefore, they must be on frequencies to which the blind landing receivers could be set, and therefore we could listen for them. And Lindemann changed completely at that point.
And Alan brings up a paper by T.L. Eckersley to try and prove this wouldn't be the case.
He's referencing, this R.V. Jones guy is referencing Eckersley's paper on how it might be possible that this radio wave system might work. And so we go to Eckersley's paper, and this is from a couple years prior to this whole situation. So this dotted line in the center here is your attenuation layer, and this solid line is the beam. So this is to maintain a coherent beam that's useful for the purposes of navigation, right? So you would have skip zones, right? We're all familiar with this bouncing. So the plane would take off, it would have some signal here, it would have some signal here, and then globularity separation would happen, it would have nothing. It would be flying completely blind. And then it would pick up a signal right here, be like, okay, boys, we might be right here.
The paper he references is one called Multiple Signals in Shortwave Transmission, and within it, it shows a diagram of radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere. The abstract for the paper which Alan is referencing states that Eckersley is talking about an instance where radio waves are being transmitted from London to New York, which is some 10 times further than we're talking about with Knickebein. And they try and drive home how accurate they think the Knickebein beam was by saying that the Germans then used it to basically destroy the factory in Derby.
Accurate up to 250 meters to drop bombs, dog. Wow. They smoked that Rolls-Royce factory.
That's genius.
2 different locations. They intersected. They were able to successfully blow up a place that was manufacturing engines in the heart of war with people's lives at stake.
Which didn't happen. The Rolls-Royce factory in Derby was a big target for the Germans because it was the only factory that Britain had that was producing the Merlin engines used in the Hurricanes and Spitfires. Without that factory, the Royal Air Force would have been royally screwed. However, if you look at newspaper articles relating to bombings in Derby during the Second World War, it seems the Rolls-Royce factory actually got away pretty unscathed. They seemingly tried to bomb the Rolls-Royce factory on the night of August 19th, 1940, however they wound up hitting a factory 1.5 miles away. It wasn't until 1942 that they managed to bomb the factory, and that was not by a fleet of high-altitude bombers, but rather one lone bomber that was flying at very low altitude. But things are about to get a bit worse for Flat Earth. In my original video, I highlighted that after the fall of France, the Germans constructed more Knickebein sites along the English Channel. This pretty much shows Alan's claim is flawed because in reality, if the Germans had a way of producing a complete beam only 500 yards wide with an equisignal less than 250 yards wide from 450 miles away, they would have had no reason to build any more sites other than the 2 they already had in Germany, as that would give them basically complete coverage of the whole of the UK. At most, they might need 1 more in France for the planes to follow to begin with, but no more than that. Once the British had discovered Knickebein, though, they began trying to jam the signals by broadcasting the same signal in a different location to try and draw the pilots away from their intended targets. Now, according to some reports from German pilots, the signals weren't actually quite the same, and whilst this had the effect of confusing some of the newer pilots, the more experienced ones were able to distinguish between the German signal and the British jamming, and still could find their targets. However, the British jamming efforts were enough to make the Germans drop Knickebein because they now knew that the British were able to track the beams, and so the pilots were concerned that night fighters would be able to find and attack them. So they then switched to using a system called X-Gerät. Now, I was under the impression that X-Gerät was developed in response to Knickebein being jammed. However, after reading into it some more, it seems that actually X-Gerät was developed beforehand and was actually a more accurate system, however it operated at a higher frequency. So it wasn't used against Britain until after the fall of France, when stations were then constructed along the Channel coast. And they were only used for closer targets such as Coventry and Bristol. Apparently, Kampfgruppen 100 were bombing Liverpool and couldn't use the X-Gerät systems because Liverpool was beyond its range. Alan didn't seem to address any of those points, though, about why they needed to build more antennas closer to the UK if they had already such good coverage, or why the British oboe system couldn't be used for targets in Berlin because it was too far away. However, more damning is in an article, which I will link below, that was kindly sent to me by one of my viewers, John, in which it details a lot about Knickebein and then X-Gerät. And one very interesting passage, which reads, "The X-Gerät system also laid 3 very narrow crossbeams across the director beam prior to the target, which allowed the aircraft's ground speed to be determined and the bomb release point to be computed by a special bombing clock mechanism on board the plane. The 0.05 degree fine director beam was so narrow that in calculating its bearing, a 5-figure log table had to be used to take account of the fact that the Earth isn't a perfect sphere, it's slightly flattened near the poles." So seemingly, not only were the German navigation systems more than able to work on a globe, some of them had to be finely calibrated to account for the exact shape of the globe. And that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.